Welcome to the Press Row. Behind-the-scenes stories from the world of sports media. Press Row. Insight and interviews from around the sports world. Now here's your host, Jonah Siegel.
Welcome back in the Press Row. Jonah here out in Seattle. Happy to be back for another week. Topic this week is baseball, something we haven't done for a little while. Season is going exceptionally well. I mean, obviously depending on your team, but all factors are pointing up for the game. Attendance is up, TV numbers are up. Exception of players complaining about the quality of uniforms, things are looking pretty good for the national pastime. And to talk about that, a friend of the show, friend of mine, John Morosi of Major League Network. And get into all kinds of things, more at a national level than necessarily a team-by-team thing. We do dig into a couple of teams, Blue Jays, the Mariners, obviously the Yankees, but I think you'll really enjoy a more broad discussion about TV deals, where the game's going, potential expansion, what teams should be doing, Rob Manfred, things like that. So sit back, relax, and enjoy today's discussion with John Morosi. Welcome back in the Press Row. Jonah here. Seattle, a beautiful start to the morning. Thank God it has just been Noah's Ark-like here recently. And very thrilled to have a good friend of the show back on. He is making his way, I understand, from South Detroit, as they like to call it, in that awesome song. And as everybody knows, there's no such thing as South Detroit, but whatever. South Detroit is Canada. He is making his way from Detroit-ish to Toronto-ish, if you will. He is John Morosi from MLB Network. John, how are you?
Jonah, I'm outstanding. How about this? We're doing a live pod. I'm at the Woodstock, Ontario en route stop. So somewhat intriguingly, I am in Canada, and you are in the States. and as you say, South Detroit is Windsor. That's the
right.
unique part. And I actually began my 2024 New Year's Eve, 23 into 24, with a great Windsor versus Sarnia OHL game in Windsor. So I was able to see a Spitfires Sting game. Pretty special year with the Memorial Cup being in Michigan. So our two countries together in so many ways here, Jonah.
Oh, that's fantastic. Well, for those of you not on YouTube or not watching, John Paul has a awesome tan. So clearly he's spending more time on baseball than he is on OHL and college hockey, as you sometimes see him. Everything good with you, your family? Everybody's doing well?
All doing great, Jonah. It's we're just wrapped up the school year in Michigan. So now we're into the summer phase and the kids getting into their summer activities. It's a great time of year, of course, all around baseball. I love the hockey, obviously, this time of year, too. I'm planning on going to the draft in Vegas in a couple of weeks. I've actually never covered an NHL draft in person, but with the unique situation now of it being the last fully in-person draft, we're told. And certainly the venue is interesting with it being at the Sphere. So I said, hey, this is the opportunity. So it's going to be a busy week for me. We've got a showcase game in St. Louis on Monday, and then Yankees-Mets on Wednesday, and then NHL draft. So a very Morosi kind of a week. And then this week, of course, we've got our showcase game Wednesday as we're speaking here on a Tuesday, Red Sox, Blue Jays on MLB Network. So my first trip to Rogers Center this year, I get a chance to see the new renovations. I've seen a lot of them on TV, certainly, but excited to see it all in person.
Fantastic. Well, you got to admire somebody who goes into an event and it's one and done, because there isn't going to be another one apparently, and admire you for going to the Sphere to check. If you're going to do it, go big or go home. So
amen. Do it right.
So let's talk a little MLB, and we're gonna zoom out before we zoom in. You know, Rob Manfred has it's been announced or he's kind of announced that he's gonna play out this term, and that's gonna be that. He's been an interesting character as commissioner, certainly not as controversial, if you will, as Bud Selig. Not nearly as, I don't think he's been as long-termed. What do you think he wants to accomplish before the end of the term, before he's done?
Great question, Jonah. I think two things probably stand out just coming to mind right now. One is the media consumption strategy for the game long term, where you can watch your baseball, streaming, linear television, on your phone, on your tablet, however you can get baseball. I think his guiding principle in a lot of ways is, how do I make the game as accessible as possible to as many people as possible? And in-market streaming is there for some teams and in some markets, and not for others. You've got a couple teams that are being produced now by MLB's production assets. Of course, initially it was Padres and Diamondbacks last year. Does that increase to more places, perhaps, in the future? But I do think that long-term strategy, I think the commissioner will probably say, if more fans in more places around the world can watch the game however they want to by the end of his tenure, that's a success. I also think that he would like to see the game, if not necessarily have 32 teams by the time he leaves office, for there to be a pathway to get there. And we're seeing certainly there's been recent news, encouraging news with the ballpark in Tampa Bay. That's been very encouraging. Obviously, the A's temporary home in Sacramento, eventually going to Las Vegas. None of these moves or ballpark scenarios are easy, but I think the commissioner sees there being a lot of virtue and value in getting those situations on the right course, because once Tampa is resolved, once the Oakland move to Las Vegas is fully complete, then you can look at going to 32 teams. And he has been saying for years, Jonah, that in his estimation, it's a lot easier to schedule with groups of 4s or 8s in terms of the symmetry of a 32-team major league, where maybe you go to 2 separate 16-team leagues. Maybe you align geographically in a more dramatic way. Obviously, now that the DH is standard, it creates a situation where there's an option, at least, to go with Yankees and Mets in the same division, or Angels, Dodgers in the same division, and do some really creative things with scheduling to make it maybe a little closer to what the other sports are in terms of the geography, as opposed to the long-standing league identity. So I think those are all things that are in the growth area. And I think finally, Jonah, I would say this, that look at the success of the London series. I was there in Seoul when the season began. That was amazing. Reports of potentially beginning next season in Japan. The World Baseball Classic, the way that ended in 2023 was an extraordinary moment for the sport. So I think the international growth of the game is certainly top of mind as well.
Awesome. So let's key in on media just for a second, and let's just call it watching, because watching means different things, as you articulated. Baseball is unique in that it's not a national watching event per se. And part of that, I think, is a cap issue, in that they don't have one, and that all the teams aren't on equal footing. The Yankees make, I think, somewhere around $70 million or something from their local TV deal. The team that plays in my backyard here has cried poor, in part because they don't have a wealthy TV deal. And what's happened with Root Sports, the implosion of the regional sports network, is a massive problem, I would imagine, or massive issue, I won't say problem, for Major League Baseball and other sports. How does he cross that bridge where you've got huge haves and have-nots and very powerful owners who make a lot of money, when he wants to build that chasm of a national TV audience? I assume that's what you mean.
Well, I think it's a great question, Jonah, and I think it's part of the inherent challenge of this. And I think one of the, if you even zoom out a little bit, let's take this for example. The New York Yankees, you can watch their games on Yes. So the Yes Network, if you're a local cable subscriber in New York. So you can watch their games on Yes. They also stream a number of games on Prime Video. A lot of their games are available on the national rights holders, including our MLB Network Showcase package. But that is not our broadcast in that situation is not available in market. So that's the national broadcast. But
Right.
if you're a Yankee fan, you'd watch the Yes Network broadcast. So MLB Network, Turner, Fox, ESPN, Roku on Sundays. There's a lot of different ways to watch the game. And I think that is part of the inherent challenge. It's also, if you look at this difference, if you are a team-owned network, Yes, Nesson, Marquee in Chicago, LA, Spectrum Sportsnet, those conversations about streaming in market are fundamentally different than the Bally Group, and then also the teams that are being broadcast by MLB, such as I mentioned earlier, teams like the Diamondbacks and the Padres. Think about what a different scenario each of those things represents. You've got the Yankees owning their own network, owning their own in-market streaming rights, and then you have the MLB-produced games, which I think MLB has done a great job of making those games available to you. If you're a Padre fan in San Diego or anywhere, you've got the ability to purchase that streaming package to make sure you can watch all the games. So it's all about accessibility. But you're exactly right. This is not the NFL. This is not a centrally distributed scenario in which the Dallas Cowboys get X, the Packers get X, the Tampa Bay Buccaneers get X. That there's that national revenue share of all national broadcasts. Every broadcast in the NFL is a national broadcast. It's fundamentally different in baseball and always will be. The other thing that I want to point out and say on sort of to wave the flag a bit for baseball on what it means for these different data of streaming, data of watching, whatever it might be, is you consider total hours watched or the amount of time you're spending with the product. I often think sometimes baseball, if you're comparing, well, look at this Tuesday night game between the Yankees and the Orioles, and why doesn't it rate the way that a Cowboys-Packers game does? Well, again, the Cowboys and Packers play once a week, and the Yankees play 6 or 7 times a week. And so if you really accumulate the amount of time that's being spent watching the product, it adds up in terms of the viewership. I also think that I have always pushed back a bit when the criticism has come where let's just take Mike Trout, for example, in his prime. Oh, Mike Trout is not ubiquitous enough. He's not as ubiquitous as LeBron James, is to use a name from basketball. Well, if we acknowledge that in sports like basketball, hockey, I think they're very much indexed towards the individual person. I think the individual star. You might have a Connor McDavid fan who lives in Buffalo. You might have an Austin Matthews fan who lives in Kansas City. They will follow that individual player. LeBron is a very good example of this. But in baseball, if you're a Chicago White Sox fan, but you're then asking the White Sox fan to also spend a lot of time in his or her week watching Mike Trout, well, so you're asking that person to spend 21 hours a week watching the White Sox and then 21 more hours a week watching Mike Trout. That's like a job. That's 42 hours a week consuming baseball. That's a lot. But I think that we have to fundamentally reset what it means to be a baseball fan and how much you have to, quote unquote, spend with the sport in order to consider yourself or qualify yourself as a baseball fan.
Well, I think there's a couple of things that you've said that interest me. One, we've avoided a topic, which is money. And behind all of this, there's that. Two, there's the relationship with the union. And that's a major factor. And I'll follow up with three. I do think Manfred deserves a lot of credit for the result because attendance is up. The numbers are good. The TV numbers are up. And I have to credit that for the rule changes. Listen, the players play. It's their game. That's why we go. That's why we watch. But the fact that a game can now be played in 2-ish hours versus 3 or 4, whatever it was, is a massive improvement. It just is. Call it what it is for the exact reasons that you just said. But ultimately, if you want people to watch Mike Trout or anybody else in a market, they have to fix this problem where your team is out of it. Your team is not out of it come May 15th, right? Like that imbalance of the haves or the have-nots is going to dissipate if there's a more competitive balance and teams have, you don't have the Dodgers, the Yankees with this massive amounts of money being spent, and you've got other teams not being competitive. And I would imagine somewhere in there are the players going WTF, because right now the battles I'm hearing between the union and the league are over the quality of the uniforms, which is pretty hilarious.
Well, there's a lot there, Jonah. And I would say this, however, if you look at last year's result, the National League represents in the postseason. So, and I'm not saying that's necessarily going to happen every year, but the commissioner actually has talked about from a competitive standpoint. Yeah, you're right. There is certainly that bifurcation of the haves and the have-nots, but there's also a vast middle that's still in it right now. And I think that if you're going to have an economic disparity that does exist and is real, I suppose on some level, the expansion of the playoffs is a good thing because
Right.
it gives hope in more places. If while you're correct in saying, okay, the teams that are the super teams, those that are really great right now, how many great teams do we have in the sport? You would say the Yankees are a great team. The Orioles are a great team. The Guardians are very good, maybe great. The Phillies, great team. The Dodgers are great. So it's probably a half a dozen, give or take, really strong teams. The Braves, when they're healthier, are in that conversation too, but they've been in a rough run of form because of injuries in the last 3 or 4 weeks. So I would say you've got a half a dozen teams, give or take, that are excellent. You've got a few that are clear stellars, White Sox, Marlins, but really not that many. Not that many that are just completely out of it. And even some teams like the Rockies that probably should be out of it aren't going to sell because they just don't. So when you look at the big picture here, the Red Sox, we're seeing them in Toronto this week. They're not a dominant team, but look at them. They're right in the playoff conversation. The Jays, for all their faults, are still in the playoff conversation. And so I think part of those attendance numbers, speaking as someone who lives in a state, Michigan, where the team is really similar to the Jays in a lot of ways, just below 500, just interesting enough. Are they going to buy? Are they going to sell? They're compelling. They're not great, but they're compelling. That is said in a lot of different places around Major League Baseball right now. And it gets to the conversation of what you really want your team to be. If you can't be a super team, and the Orioles, obviously, they are held up as the paragon of when a rebuild goes right, which is hard to do, by the way, but they're an example of what happens when it's done very well. Most of the teams are not the Orioles. Most of the teams, like the Jays, like the Tigers, like the Giants, like a team like the Reds, they're somewhere in the middle. They're interesting enough. And I think we have to ask ourselves, is the goal of running a team, and this is Jerry DiPoto in a market that you know well, basically said this out loud last year and was criticized for it. The idea that he was advancing is play better than 500 most of the time, and you'll get in the playoffs some of the time, and you will, generally speaking, have an interesting product that the fans will pay their money to see. I'm paraphrasing Jerry's words, but that's basically what he was trying to say. And I think that in a lot of ways, look at the attendance numbers, Jonah. That's effectively what the fans are saying. We like interesting teams. And there may be some fan bases that are a bit more discerning or more demanding, and that's as part of the nature of the game. But I think that fans in Detroit, my family is included in this, they're interested. They're not in love with the team, but they're intrigued. They like Riley Green. They like Tarek Skubal. There are enough players here that they find compelling that they're involved and invested. And I think that is its own form of success. Maybe it's not what some of the more analytically driven fans would want, which is, hey, you're either winning the World Series or you're totally rebuilding. I actually don't like that. I think that you should have a competitive team. It's one of the reasons why so far I understand why the Jays have not pushed the reset button on this team, because they're close enough. They just renovated the ballpark. The team is interesting. They're not great, but they're interesting. And I think that's where a lot of teams are across baseball.
So do you think, excuse me, do you think that's a factor of ownership? I hate keeping coming back to it. Do you think that's a factor of money? Because if you can be competitive enough to garner enough interest that people will come out to the park, you have season ticket sales. But my understanding that for most teams, it's really about the walk-up. So come June, July, August, if you can be sniffing around the playoffs, enough people will walk up and buy tickets. Enough people will watch your games on TV. Maybe they'll even listen on the radio if you know what that is. That'll generate revenue. And if you make the playoffs, that's where the real money is. So being in the mushy middle, although it's abhorrent, to the diehard that may keep score when they go to the game, That's going to pay your bills. And that's a better model. That's a better model than spending a ton of dough that doesn't necessarily guarantee you anything. Hello, New York Mets.
I was just going to mention that. And there's the outlier. The really interesting team that has spent a lot of money is not having success right now. And last year at the deadline had a very, in their own way, even when they sold and traded Verlander and Scherzer, they flexed their financial might in the process, because what did they do? They kicked in a bunch of money when they made those trades, which allowed them to effectively buy better prospects when in return. So you're right. And I think this is where this offseason is going to be fascinating, because do we see Steve Cohen? Does he make a play to retain Pete Alonso? Does he authorize a trade of Alonso in the next month, believing that he's going to then turn around and instead, what's the quickest way in New York to make good if you trade Pete Alonso away? You sign Juan Soto away from the Yankees. That's what you do. And Steve Cohen is from the older school of owners who doesn't mind doing that. And so I think it's also good, Jonah, and certainly we lived this in Detroit for a long time with Mike Ilitch and the way that he would spend, especially once the cap came around in the NHL. It was no accident that for someone who was so civically minded, someone who was so intent on putting a competitive team on the field for Detroit, it's no accident. The Red Wings, after their Stanley Cup run, they'd won 3 cups in a span of basically 7-8 years. Then the cap comes in, so we can't spend as much on the wings. That happens in the 04-05 lockout. What happens in 06? The Tigers make it to the World Series with Magglio Ordonez, Pudge Rodriguez, players that he had spent money on at a time when he couldn't spend the money on the hockey team. And so I think that becomes an interesting case study where if you have enough owners who do regard this as something of a hobby and they're willing to go above and beyond what their normal luxury tax threshold would suggest. The Phillies are another example, and John Middleton. Look at the spending that he has done. He wanted Bryce Harper. He went out and got him. He wanted Schwarber. He wanted Castellanos. He wanted Trey Turner. He went out and got him. It's good for the game. I think there's enough different approaches here. I like that there are smart, well-run organizations in the middle that are spending enough, maybe not a lot, but enough to have a competitive team. And then there are those at the top that are putting some upward pressure on the industry, saying, hey, keep up with us, because we haven't forgotten that in this non-salary cap sport, you can still do this. You can still do what Steve Cohen does, and what the Phillies do. I like that. And so there's enough of a different menu for various approaches here that I think works. And I also believe wholeheartedly, Jonah, that there are enough rebuilds that have failed. We talk about, the Orioles right now are the one that succeeded. The Astros succeeded. The Cubs succeeded. But a lot of other teams didn't. Check out the last decade of the Angels or the last decade of the Tigers and how many fits and starts there have been. There's no guarantee of success. And so for that reason, the boom and bust cycle for me, I'm less and less of a fan of that.
So it seems to me that what you're basically saying is, go with me for a second, I can't think of a team in any sport recently that has relocated as a result of fans not supporting. It's typically the business market that doesn't support the team. It's usually fans will buy tickets, but they don't get enough corporate support. They're not selling boxes, they're not selling suites, they're not selling dasher boards. It's the business community that they can't get to spend, or government won't build them a new stadium, how dare they? It's not usually Joe and Jane fan aren't coming out. Case in point, you look at the Athletics even now, that team is leaving. It has flatlined, and there's people still going to those games. That is hard for me to believe. So owners know, thank you, P.T. Barnum, there's a sucker born every day. And as ticked off as we get as fans, we don't ever vote with our feet. We don't not go, right? We say it all the time. The team in Toronto has, with a lot of audacity, announced the season ticket renewal is now prior to the deadline. That is not a coincidence, right? It just can't be. So if the teams know that we're going to come out, if they can just keep it moderately interesting, as you said, and as the GM said here in Seattle, if you can sniff around to potentially make the playoffs every once in a while, stay in the black as opposed to the red, then you've got yourself a good business. And then eventually when your owner sells, he, she, or they will actually make a lot of money. Is that the model that we're talking about?
I think that's certainly one way of looking at it. I also think that, to use your example of the Mariners right now, when I do generally have a more incremental approach at the deadline most of the times in terms of what a team is going through, where, the extreme cycles tend to not be as effective. But Seattle is one very special case, and you know that team carefully and watch it closely. That team, with their pitching, they are truly a bat, maybe two bats away from being a potential World Series team, no matter what their win total is in the regular season. Because we know that the Yankees and Orioles are extraordinary teams, and they'll probably finish with more regular season wins than Seattle. But when your pitching is that good and your needs are that clear, go get the bats. So I think Seattle, it's interesting. While Jerry Dipoto advanced that idea about being just a little bit higher than average in terms of the win total, ironically, he has built the team that I'm looking at and say, wow, that's a really good rotation. The bullpen's certainly solid. The complementary players in that group have done well. They need one or two more major bats. And so that is the one very specific case of go for it.
Okay.
Go for it. I wouldn't advise that for everybody, but I guess what I'm saying, Jonah, is that there are certainly some outliers here where fan support and demands do make sense to go for it all. And I do think that Seattle is the one case study I'm watching carefully this year.
Okay, but lots of teams, and you're a hell of a lot smarter than me, and you're going to pull up references. But growing up a Blue Jay fan, there were always times where come the trade deadlines, because there used to be two of them,
right?
Where if the team was sniffing close to the playoffs, love the people walking behind you, by the way. Everyone's getting their Tim Hortons. It's great to see. It is the team would go out and pull the trigger and go get the guy or the guys, a la Ricky Henderson, a la David Cohen, right? Like that
Randy
was
Johnson,
right? Like that was always the hope, and that's not unique to the Blue Jays. You'll rattle it off. That's why the deadline is always such a thing in any sport. Is that if your team is sniffing around, the smart GM, the smart owner knows. People always joke, my team doesn't want to win. The owners just want to make money. And that's bullshit, because at the end of the day, the best way for the owner to make money is to make the playoffs. That's where they make all their money. They make more money by making the playoffs. So here's my question. Here in Seattle, the most frustrated fans are those that look at the team, they blame the GM, but I really think it's the owner who just tied the GM's hands. Wasn't it last year at the deadline they sold when they should have been buying? I mean, isn't that what history has shown? You tell me.
Right. Well, that's a very fair point. And I will say that there are still a couple things here. There is I think, a generally more cautious approach by a lot of the more analytically inclined executives, because they really tend to analyze the downsides of these moves. It's almost as though being willing to make a deal and accepting the consequences and being bold is the new favorable inefficiency, right? To where if the rest of the industry is a little bit tepid when it comes to making a trade, if you have a GM who's not afraid, you're in a good spot. Take, for example, AJ Preller. Now, we could argue whether or not the Juan Soto trade worked out. And in fact, there are many who believe that the Nationals clearly won that deal, because you look at Abrams and Gore and Wood and Hassel. They did a really good job, the Nationals did, of getting max value from the Padres for Juan Soto. It was exciting for the Padre fans in a vacuum that particular year, and they did win a playoff round. They did beat the Dodgers, so there was something they got out of it. But it's an interesting case study, and certainly look at CC Sabathia with the Brewers all those years ago. They gave up Michael Brantley to get him, and they had him for half a season. But again, they made the playoffs. They ended a playoff drought. So there are contextually, Jonah, there are some very unique moments in which it does make sense to do this. The other part that I will say, this is my favorite thing to bring up to people at this time of year. I love doing this, and I'll say it to you now. There are two ways that you can make trades at the deadline, okay? One is by utilizing your financial capital to take on more and more salary. And then if you take on, generally speaking, if you take on more salary, the prospect price tends to be lower. The other part is like what we saw with the trades last year. To get the better prospect in return, of course, maybe you end up if you're the selling club, like for example with the Mets, then you eat more of the money, so to speak. The other piece of it is if your prospects are that good and you're the buying team, you can convince the selling team, okay, that hey, I'm going to give you this full value prospect, but you're going to have to pay some of the money in return. That's the way you can do it. So if this is my favorite line, if your prospects are as good as you have told me they are, then you should be able to get more value on the market because the industry will say, wow, you're giving me someone that's excellent. I will therefore continue paying the salary of my veteran player to make sure that I get your A-level prospect back. That's the biggest truth teller of them all. You can have your prospect lists. You can have your perceptions of whose farm system is the best, but the trades ultimately will tell you what the industry believes about your young players. And if your young players are good enough, teams will basically say, wow, I'm trading you my veteran pitcher right now who's on an expiring contract. I'll continue paying his full salary to get rid of him because I love the prospect I'm getting back that much. And that is the ultimate truth teller. It's not always, and we're reporting on transactions at the deadline. Pay super close attention to who is kicking in the money and who's not, because that will often tell you the true value of the prospects involved. And that is the ultimate truth serum at the trade deadline.
Right. I mean, you're covering hockey now. Brian Burke's greatest line is when he was the running the Maple Leafs was about Maple Leaf fans and Maple Leaf prior executives having what he used to call blue and white disease, and just falling in love with everybody within the organization. And you listen to the radio up there, and everyone thinks the number 5 draft pick from 3 years ago is the next coming of Connor McDavid, right? And until you go trade him and you find out he's not worth anything, do you get the real value? So I subscribe to that. All right, so let's finish on the Mariners, and I got another 2 questions for you before I let you get back on the road, literally. So I've got friends here who are diehard Mariner fans who are ready to strangle literally the manager. They think he's just done a god-awful job and continues to do that. Tell me why he shouldn't be replaced. And then 2, are they actually going to make the move to get the bat? And if they are, or bats, plural, and if they are, who are they going to get?
So first of all, I happen to think Scott Servais is a very good manager.
Okay.
Looking at his tenure with the organization, he's one of the longest tenured managers in baseball right now. And when you consider, Jonah, what he has had to work with and what has been a challenging offensive group for a long time, he has had to manage a lot of high-stress games in his tenure there. Low scoring, high stress, high leverage, utilize your pen, win a close game, and he's done it. Think about last year. He got them to within a game or 2 of the playoffs when, to your point, the GM traded his closer when they were still in position to make a run. That's hard on a manager. So I think that what he has been given to work with, Scott Servais has done an extraordinary job. I think that he has gotten better in communicating. He knows the game really well. And you look at the Astros series a couple years ago, I don't blame that series on him. I think if a couple pitches are executed differently, a play or 2 here or there, you think about the extra inning game where Jordan hit the walk-off home run. To me, he has done a very good job with that team. I really believe that. And you look at the number of young pitchers that have come up. If you were going to tell me what's the most important thing that a manager needs to know how to do in the modern game, it's how to utilize and get the best out of young pitching. He's done that. Okay. Look at their roster and look at the essence of their team. Does he have the Yankee lineup to roll out there? He probably every manager would tend to look a lot smarter if he had Soto and Judge written back to back in his lineup. And again, I think Aaron Boone's done a really good job too. But I think it's important to judge them with the personnel they've got. I think in the same token, I think Alex Cora in Boston is having a manager of the year type season. He doesn't have to win the division for me to say that. Look at what he's done with the adversity he's had to face. He's been really, really good. And I do think if the Mariners make a play for Pete Alonso, they can do that. I do think it's not just the production. If he's one of those guys where if he walked in the room it would have a massive impact. And I know that there's a lot of pressure on Steve Cohen and management there to keep him in place there in New York. But I do think Alonso to Seattle would be quite a deadline move that I do think would make sense on each side.
Probability?
I would say it's less than 50-50, but I'll put it around 35%.
Okay. All right, the team you're going to see. Riddle me this, Batman. Edward Rogers Jr. brought in Mark Shapiro. And who knows what really happened. We've heard Jerry Reinsdorf was involved. That ticked off Alex Anthopoulos. Things were said between the two of them, intimations about how Anthopoulos blew up his minor league system to take a run at it, as you've intimated that certain teams should do. You know, the Bautista team, Edwin team, that team was magical. They made a run. Unfortunately, didn't if memory serves me correctly, I think they lost to Texas. Was that the year they lost to Texas?
They lost to KC in a 6-game LCS.
Sorry,
KC. Where it was a couple really pivotal moments where they easily could have won that series. But yes, please go on.
the dome was rocking. The city had Blue Jay fever, and then Alex quit. He left, and the team has not. If you look at where the team is now and the criticism of the team today, from my feeble mind, and a lot of people like me, I'm hearing they're really not much better off than they were when Alex left. And a lot of the complaints of the organization are right back where they were, exactly what Shapiro was bitching about Anthopoulos. The minor league cupboards are bare. They have no wins to show for it that matter. Yes, the stadium looks great. Yes, Dunedin looks great. They brought in this, I forget what they call it, this health system of champions or whatever the hell it's called. They've got injuries galore. They've not signed the players they inherited who were supposed to be the future. The offseason was either a disaster or disappointing. Take your pick. They're starting to play a little bit better. They lost last night to Boston. Why should these guys keep their jobs?
It's an excellent question. I look at it this way, and like the Vlad and Bo trade conversation is there, at least conceptually. What should they do? I do not think that as long, at least for this trade deadline, for as long as Mark Shapiro and Ross Atkins are in these positions, I see almost no way that they would trade Vlad and Bo. I just don't. I think that trading Kikuchi, Garcia once he's healthy, Justin Turner, some other shorter term assets, I think is a possibility if they don't really move up the standings a lot in the next couple of weeks. But I think it's fair to ask. Certainly, it's not for me to say who should stay or go, in my opinion. But I do think if you look at the big picture, I think your assessment about where the farm system is, the infrastructure of the organization, is correct in terms of where the farm system was in 16 versus where it is in 24. You're probably correct in saying that it's comparable in terms of where it stands. And the thing about 2015 is you're right. It was magical. And as much as it stung them to give up the prospects when they did, you think about the David Price trade. They gave up Matt Boyd, Daniel Norris, who have gone on to have solid major league careers, and Boyd likely will hopefully come back as he's had surgery and is coming back. But I think they would make that trade again, Jonah, because of what that season represented. It was a special time in Toronto. And I think the vibes from that season carried them through for a long time in terms of what it meant to reinvigorate that organization. And Toronto was a baseball city. Canada is a baseball country in a way that it hadn't been since the strike of 1994. That was a very important moment for the city and for the country that I think it was well worth the cost. The issue that I come back to with the Jays right now, Jonah, and why I think it's so painful for fans to consider what selling might represent, is they have potentially missed their window without it ever really opening. And I was talking to somebody with the team in uniform earlier this season who said to me, our best team of this era was 21, and we didn't even make the playoffs. If we had made the playoffs, and as you know, Jonah, it went down to the last day. If they had made the playoffs, that was the year when Vladdy was playing like an MVP and Semien was playing like an MVP too. They basically had two MVP caliber hitters in the middle of the lineup or the top. And if they had made the playoffs that year, he said, we could have won the World Series. And I think that's actually correct. They were that good. And obviously didn't work out. We're now at this point where they haven't won a playoff game since then. And that's why it's so painful. I think the Jays fans feel as though there was a moment in time where they maybe could have gone a bit more all in because you're looking for one game. One game gets in the playoffs. And I think that's the painful part to where, darn it, where was that one game that they missed? You look at other times where they could have easily gone maybe a little bit further. They'd had one more component. You go back to the Barrios game last year in the playoffs. It's been a story of missed opportunities. And I think for that reason, there is a lot of emptiness. Now, you think about this, Jonah. They took that job in the fall of 2015. That was 9 years ago. They won a playoff round the next year in 16 with largely Alex's team, and they have not won a playoff round since then. And I think that's where it's especially difficult, especially when you consider not having Vlad and Bo signed and not really having a clear path to do either.
And no future. I mean, literally, at least, you always had the 16-year-old Vlad sitting in the minors to look forward to. You got nothing.
Right.
They traded the guys that they were most excited about, and don't have much to show for them either, right? I mean, that's what I think bothers people, is that they came in with the arrogance of the other guy is spending prospects. We are going to build a franchise from the bottom up so that the farm system is always full, so that we're not just going to win once like he tried to do. We're going to be continually winning, and we're going to build this the right way. And yet, not only did they not win, the system is empty. There's nothing.
That's fair. And it's not completely empty necessarily.
You
but
know,
you're right.
you know what I mean.
It's a right now, by most scouting services, a lower third of the major leagues system, in the opinion
you're contemplating trading two guys because the team's not that close. They haven't performed to expectations. Neither has the team, and that's the way to replenish the system.
Correct. And I would say this, Jonah, and one of the reasons why, and you're right. I mean, they're if you compare what Baltimore has to what the Jays have, there's no comparison. Tampa Bay, they've got Junior Caminero and others. They've got a really good farm system as usual, and they have some pitchers coming back from surgery next year that they hope will have a big impact. But I think, to your point, it is not just about 2024. It is about the question that I think should be basically hanging over the door of the front office every day is this one. How soon are we going to be better than Baltimore or New York? Question mark. How soon are we going to be better than Baltimore or New York? We can all watch baseball right now, Jonah. We know it's not going to happen in 2024, and it's probably not going to happen in 2025 either. And so if that's the case, if that's your time horizon, and you're looking at your roster and you're saying, wow, if it's definitely not happening this year, and it's probably not happening in 25, and Vlad and Bo are free agents after 25, tough. And that's where, to me, if you're at the headspace as an organization to where you believe that you're not going to be as good as Baltimore next year no matter what you do, then you almost have to trade Vlad and Bo. And then you have to look at it and say, if we're going to do that, are we going to entrust Ross Atkins with that task? Or is it James Click or someone else? But we're in the middle of June now, Jonah. The chances for someone new to come in and make that decision, if you were at that headspace, this decision should have been made a while ago. And they haven't been above 500 since April. You're looking at a lot of different data points that say, where are we going?
Right.
And I think that it's a very fair question to ask. And I just think that either they're the people that you trust to make the decision, in which case you should let them make the decision and let them make the moves and let them do it now. Or if they're not, and you're pivoting to a new future, then find the group that you entrust to do that, because you're 9 years in. You are 9 years in with this group. And to me, it's hard to then expect different results from the same process.
So I'll let you go in a minute, but that's the question. The question really is, who's making that call? Because if it's the owner, which is Rogers, Edward Rogers Jr., someone there, respectfully, he's not smart enough. He's not a baseball guy to make that call. So who's educating him? I suspect Shapiro's educating him. And does he have the cojones to say what you just said? And is he going to separate himself from his man, Ross Atkins? I mean, to be honest, I kind of say this duckingly to my friend, Mr. Morosi. He had the board approval to go sign Shohei Ohtani for a lot of money.
Right.
On an airplane, not on an airplane. He had the authority he had the authority. I know he had the authority to write the check. That's a lot of money. That's a huge commitment. And you got to believe if that happens, they're a better team. So
sure.
Right.
And again, so we're speaking in June now. That all happened 7 months ago. The notion that Mark Shapiro and Ross Atkins had the trust of ownership to put in more than $500 million on an offer 6-7 months ago, and that now they have no faith. It's difficult to reason your way through that. It's difficult to say, well, what has happened since then, when basically they did pivot. They brought in Turner and IKF, which actually those contracts are not the problem right now, if we're being fair. So you're right. It's not really fair. If I'm looking at it from Mark Shapiro and Ross Atkins' position, if the question comes to them, should we trust you to go forward? Well, you were trusting me with more than $500 million half a year ago. So at that point in time, what has really changed since then? I mean, it's effectively the same team minus an Ohtani. From that rhetorical perspective, they've added in some players who have had mixed results. I do think it is such an interesting call in so many different ways, and I do think though this is part of I think why it made sense for them to go after Ohtani when they did. It is that international monetization, global streaming rights of a team, global brand of an international brand, all of these different dimensions of why that made sense. To a lesser extent, Vlad and Bo are not superstars on his level, clearly, but they are superstars, I would say, in Canada, that they are well known in Canada. And I think that there's an understanding that to sell the streaming subscriptions, to sell the broadcast, to sell the brand, to sell the jerseys, to sell the tickets, you've got to have stars. And I think the reason why you pursued Ohtani was not just because of the player, it's because of all that he brought. And I think all that he brought, you're looking for ways to hopefully approximate that in other talents. Obviously, he's a one of one, but I think that's part of the reason why they have not changed the management yet and why they have not changed the roster yet. I think there is still a belief that to have the functioning business, that star players by the names of Guerrero and Bichette, and obviously Biggio has now moved on, the Dodgers, ironically enough, there is still an understanding that you do have to sell tickets and sell a brand, and I think that is complicating what might otherwise be a relatively clear-eyed baseball assessment that this team, Jonah, certainly according to me and according to many, is not as good as Baltimore or New York now, and I'm not sure when that will change in the near term.
The problem is, and I'll let you go, and thank you for your time, is they have the wherewithal to fix it. And that carrot is there. If they want to spend the money this offseason and go get Soto, they can do it. They have the money. And that is there. And they know from 15, if they're there, that dome will be full. It'll be rocking. The TV ratings will be through the roof. And it's not just Toronto, it's coast to coast. And that's the most appealing and the most dangerous. And that's why those guys haven't been fired.
Well, that's an excellent point. And the last thing I'll say is that the universe of teams, Jonah, that have, to your point, and why I'm still a big-time believer in Toronto and in Canada as a baseball market and one that can be successful for many, many years. Go back and look at the number of teams that have drawn 3 million fans at any point in the last decade, or how many times they've passed that number. And Toronto's in a very select group of teams that has done it and can do it. And for that reason, they're still going to be a player. As flawed as they are, Jonah, they're still going to be a player, and they're still a fun team to follow and talk about.
He is John Paul Morosi from Major League Baseball Network. We love having him on. He does it better than anybody else out there on the national level. Have fun up in Toronto. We look forward to having you again. Safe travels.
Thanks, Jonah. The 402 awaits. I look forward to the drive. Thanks so much.
Hope you enjoyed today's discussion with Frankie Corrado. I think there's some really unique nuggets there that you haven't heard before. His insights on successful coaches, what his career was like with, John Tortorella. A lot of people don't like John, hearing how it's like now, his relationship with players when he goes into locker rooms. Really cool, insightful stuff. I hope that you found that unique. I certainly did. As always, be sure to subscribe wherever you are listening to this, whatever your podcasting network of choice is. If it's YouTube, you can follow along there as well. Please tell everyone about it. We do appreciate that. At the same time, follow on all your social networks at YYZ Sports Media on TikTok, on Twitter, and on Instagram. At the same time, if you want to get in touch with me, you can DM me on those platforms. At the same time, you can email me. Email is jonah@yyzsportsmedia.com. And we will see you next time in the press row. Thank you very much.